It's about the restoration of our republic. We want to educate, encourage, enable the power. We stand for integrity, honesty, self-reliance, self-defense, and most importantly, no compromise on our foundational principles. This is America's Voice Now.
Find America's Voice Now on Facebook and at americasvoicenow.org. Here's Michael Evans.
Good morning, America. You're listening to America's Voice Now. My name is Michael Evans. I'll be your host this morning. Glad to have you with us. You're joining us live on our website. That's great news. You're catching us live on Patriot FB. We should be streaming video there shortly, Jeff. And in addition to that, of course, we are always live on americasvoicenow.org. And our show repeats every night at on Big Country Radio, Big Country 99, between 12 and 2, midnight and 2. So just wanted to thank those of you who are joining us live on our website this morning. I see a whole bunch of you out there. I got New York on there, Sugar Cane, is it? Sugar Grove. Fort Wayne, I think that's Indiana. Lebanon, looks like New York. Palm Coast. Fort Walton Beach, Mountain Home. I see Mountain Home in there. Welcome, Mountain Home. Some California. I see Texas in there. I see Louisiana in there. I see some folks up in Chicago. So anyway, we're glad to have you on board. Thanks very much for joining with us live. We're going to tackle 4 specific topics this morning. This is Friday, so it's TGIF, certainly for me. Our first topic this morning is going to be, are Muslims infiltrating the U.S. government with the help of Barack Obama? I think we're going to find at the end of this segment that the answer to that question is absolutely. There has been some startling appointments made, including one which was recently made for a Robert Malley, who's now been appointed as the senior director of all things, the National Security Council. Huh? Yeah, you heard me right. I mean, what was that all about? And in February, President Obama met the Muslim Brotherhood leader in the White House. Interesting. There are a glut of news stories out there which reflect the fact that the President of the United States has been loading the dice, shall we say, in the government with people who are friendly towards or affectatious towards the Muslim frame of mind. Let's just leave it at that. And there are some of these that are Hamas supporters. Some of these are Al-Qaeda supporters. Some of these are PLO supporters. Some of these are supporters of Iran. I'm not saying that there's a problem with Muslims in general, but when you've got people who have a high position in government that have a friendly relationship with jihadist organizations that are named as known terrorist organizations, you got a problem. And I'm not the only one saying it, folks, although you're probably not hearing very much about it on the mainstream media Ministry of Propaganda channels because they're not telling you the truth. And in fact, if we get into our second segment on FCC monitors and how that's a bad idea for the Republic, you're going to hear even less. But I want to save all that fire for that segment. Our third segment is going to be why your AR-15, will your AR-15 fail you when you need it most? There's a new article out there this morning, and I'm going to make sure that you get an opportunity to understand what's going on with it. In the Washington Times, it's a very lengthy article, actually, and the headline is, "Our troops have been left to fend for themselves when the Army was warned in flaws of the Army's M4 carbine." So we're going to talk a little bit about that because I know that a lot of folks out there are AR-15 owners, And while I cannot personally own one, at one point in time, I was considered a pretty fair armorer, and so I'm somewhat familiar with the issues surrounding these particular claims. And so we're going to talk about that because what I want to do is make sure that you have your ducks in a row when it comes to something that you may have to rely upon for your life or the lives of your family or the protection and defense of your home. And you can pick the threat, but if the weapon doesn't perform the way it's supposed to perform, then you got a problem. Our final segment will be, what is DLE terrorism, and why has it become an epidemic in the United States of America? Well, DLE terrorism, and I'm sure I'm going to get a slew of email about this. DLE terrorism, domestic law enforcement terrorism, being perpetrated upon the innocent citizens of the nation. Ladies and gentlemen, it has reached an epidemic. It is the new American epidemic. Murder by cop. We're going to explore that thoroughly. All right. Let's jump back to our first segment and get into that story. Before we go there, I'm going to give out our listen line phone number. Make sure that you jot this down if you have any interest whatsoever in being able to catch America's Voice on our listen line, which is totally free to you to use. It's area code 415-325-0725. That's 415-325-0725. Now, for the record, that service costs you nothing. You just dial in. You'll hear a brief 8-second recording that says, you're listening to America's Voice, and boom, you get your own private, personal audio track of the last recorded show. So anytime after about 10 o'clock this morning, this will be the program that you would hear. I encourage you to not only use it yourself if you're traveling in a vehicle. There are some controls that you can utilize there, and so you may want to listen to some of the instructions to see whether or not there's a way for you to kind of jump forward. I'm not quite sure how functional those controls are, but it does give you a great opportunity to listen to the program when you're not either in a terrestrial radio broadcast area or you don't have access to the internet to catch it live or on a podcast. So anyway, again, that number is 415-325-0725. And I would encourage you to not only use that number yourself, but share it with others who you know would want to hear the program. Okay, so the problem that we have here is a scenario where we are injecting individuals within our higher echelons of government who have a significant track record of activity with subversive and say that, there's another 9/11 coming and all of that. Because the truth is, and we'll touch on this in our fourth segment when we talk about domestic law enforcement terrorism, you have a greater chance of being killed by your own government, whether that be military or law enforcement, whether that's state, federal, or local, than you do of being killed in a terrorist attack. And that's the simple reality of it, folks. I mean, let's be candid. More Americans have been killed at the hands of law enforcement since 9/11 than more of our soldiers have been killed in Iraq. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more in depth. But the real challenge that we have here is that irrespective of whether you believe that the Muslims are a threat in terms of a jihadist terror attack, there's no denying the fact that they are intent on infiltrating the United States of America for the simple purpose of instituting Sharia law. We're seeing it all over the nation, much as Europe has seen it throughout its cities and nations in the Eurozone. How do I say that, or why do I say that? Well, for the record, there are entire neighborhoods in Great Britain the middle of England, in London, that you cannot go. And the police dare not tread. In fact, it's gotten so bad in merry old England that they actually have their own Sharia courts. And the government allows this. Make up their communities are being inundated, and they are relentless and they are tireless about making changes to the societal structure and the culture of these nations. I watched a video the other day, which I posted up on our Facebook and our YouTube and website, about how in the United States of America there was a group of individuals. And it's about a 20-minute video, but you'll be stunned when you watch it. Basically, it's a group of individuals who are standing there with signs, and they're Christian, and they're surrounded by groups of Muslims. And during the entire videotape, while the police are standing there watching, these Muslims are throwing milk crates, soda bottles, soda cans, rocks, fruit, eggs. I mean, it's unbelievable. And meanwhile, and you can hear the people on the video incredulously saying, I can't believe the cops aren't doing anything about this. See, what we have in this position is a culture which is trying to replace the organic culture of the nation. So think of it like this. When a bad cell makeup, i.e. a tumorous cancer, gets into the system, it begins to kill those cells around it and attempt to take over the host. And mark my words when I say this, that is exactly where this is headed. That's the intention, that's the purpose, that's the motivation. This is not about a fair crack for Muslims and Islamics in the United States. This is all about their philosophy that, one, any non-Muslim is subjected to their rule, and there are no rules and no laws that they have to adhere to or abide by with reference to that individual. They may feel free to wreak whatever havoc they would choose upon that individual. And they can do it openly and with the approval of their imams and allegedly their Quran. Now, I'm not here to judge Islam as a religion. I'm talking about the people. And I would say the same thing, by the way, about the ultra-rigid Christian who says, well, because I believe that you can't drink and you can't dance and you can't sing and you're not allowed to clap in church, you shouldn't either. Get out of my face. The truth is, it's no one's place to dictate what your religious beliefs should be, how you should go about exercising your religious beliefs. And this is a national problem. They may want to try to give you the impression that it's not, but I'm here to tell you it is. And where we're seeing this head is a change in the very fabric of our nation. We have incident after incident after incident. And if you don't believe that this can change the very fabric and the nature of it, like a dye, a drop of dye that gets into the fabric and immediately begins to spread out amongst the fibers, don't kid yourself. The truth is, we've already seen it. They're operating within our military, and we've already made adjustments for them. We've made cover-ups for them when we talk about the Fort Hood shooting, which was never deemed or termed a terrorist act. It was deemed a workplace incident. Really, no. So you're telling me that a guy who's been in touch with overseas terrorists, known, labeled terrorists, and is asking them for advice on whether or not it's acceptable to kill Americans in pursuit of jihad, who's having a moral crisis of conscience about what he can and cannot do in pursuit of jihad, and who yells Allahu Akbar as he fires a weapon at his stated, in writing, enemy, but it's a workplace violence action. Hello? Robert Malley, he has been pointed out for a long time, back as far as, or as early, I should say, as 2007. It was brought to the attention that the relationship between he and Barack Obama was subject to some investigation. He was the foreign policy advisor to Barack Obama, who was then a presidential candidate back in 2007. And because when this was exposed, it caused such an uproar, they cut him loose and fired him because of his ties to Hamas, to the PLO, and jihadi and anti-Israeli groups. Now, I don't care whether this isn't about Israel, so don't even go there with me. I know there's plenty of you out there who believe that ultimately, Israel is a threat to the United States just like jihad. That's not where we're going. This is about the subject of whether or not we have appointments, and we can have that conversation on whether or not the Israelis have infiltrated the United States government, and there's absolutely no doubt they have. But one wrong does not allow us to commit a second wrong. And we don't balance our nation by injecting enemies into the highest executive levels of government, regardless of what their stand or political ideology or allegiance may be. Malley was part of the American negotiating team that dealt with Yasser Arafat in Camp David. He has long been a problematic individual. In fact, at the time, we're talking about back in 2007 now, when Obama was still running for president, there was a security official who was quoted as saying, "We are noting with concern some of Obama's picks as advisors, particularly Robert Malley, who has expressed sympathy to Hamas and Hezbollah and offered accounts of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations that just don't jive with the facts." So the guy is a rewriter of history to make matters worse. He's a radical, and he should not be involved in any way, shape, or form in a position with our government. Now, WorldNet Daily has an article out there, too. And this article is a little earlier. This one goes back, I think, to 2012, when they blew the whistle on this. And U.S. Army Lieutenant General William Jerry Boykin was the one who was blowing the whistle on this, saying the Muslim Brotherhood is a radical Islamist organization that has successfully penetrated both political parties and the delicate areas of defense and national security. Well, we don't have to doubt that now, a year and a half later, because here we are looking at Malley, who, quite frankly, was, without a doubt, a dangerous character, who's now been appointed by the president to be the senior director of the National Security Council. So Boykin wasn't blowing smoke when he said that back in August of 2012. He was pointing out the fact that this is going to be the end result. And sure as shooting, it has become. Alan West blew the whistle on this a long time ago. We know that Obama has spent billions of U.S. dollars trying to prop up the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt in direct opposition to the will of the desires and the wishes of the people there. How do you account for that? And we see him doing it, by the way, in the Ukraine. Billions of dollars, $5 billion at last report, of money spent, U.S. money spent, to prop up this Ukrainian government who wants to side with Putin instead of going to the European Union, which is the will of what the people say they want. You want to know why the world looks at us with either disgust, hatred, or sheer mirth? Because what we proclaim to be, we're not. What we promise to sell, we can't deliver. And that which we preach, we definitively do not practice. You know why we'll never have the respect and or fear again in the world, on the rest of the planet? Fear is necessary to hold back your enemies, and respect is necessary to keep your allies close. We'll never have it again because in the past decade, we've allowed PC, political correctness, and, with the advent of Obama, the direct intervention of dangerous, and I do mean dangerous, jihadists within the inner circle, the inner sanctum of our government. Mark my words, folks. This will pay huge dividends for them, and we, the American people, are going to pay a terrible, terrible price. Mark my words. Hang on to this video, download it and store it somewhere, because you'll be watching this one again. We're going to take a quick break. When we return, we're going to talk about FCC monitors. I'm going to read you a brief op-ed from Ajit Pai. I say that because he is an FCC commissioner, and he's in complete opposition to this issue of why the agency is inserting monitors into the newsrooms, including newspapers, by the way, which the FCC has no purview for authorization over. We're going to look at that when we come back. You can find us live every morning at americasvoicenow.org and patriotfb.com. Patriot, F like Foxtrot, B like Bravo.com. We'll be right back. Good morning. We're in round 2 of the fight scheduled to go 4 rounds. And we're going to talk this segment about the FCC monitoring and why that's a bad idea for a republic. And, you know, it's interesting. The amount of noise that is coming out of the Ministry of Propaganda is rather stunning. And what I'm a little disturbed about, however, is the fact that what I haven't seen is them get this riled about virtually anything else that is clearly wrong with our nation. I guess my point is, why aren't they this outraged at the president's abuses relating to the National Labor Relations Board and the appointments that he's done in Congress, the unilateral violations of the Congress in regard to the lawmaking he's doing, which is lawlessness, since the president has no constitutional authority to make any law, with his failure to faithfully execute the laws, which is a direct statement right out of his oath and commitment and job duty description, and this selective prosecution that takes the rule of law and for all intents and purposes throws it out the window. Because now we don't have an objective law that is applied evenly across the board, but it's subjective based upon the whims of whoever is in power. Major problem, ladies and gentlemen. So why is it that Congress and the press, and let's leave Congress out of this for a moment, because they're irrelevant anyway, and they clapped at their own irrelevance when the president told them so in the State of the Union address. Never heard of such a thing. I was stunned beyond belief. Here's the president notifying Congress that they are obsolete and irrelevant, and he's proudly telling them so, and they are, for all intents and purposes, standing up and clapping. I could not believe it, with a smile on their faces. So here's my question, though. Why isn't the entire industry so enraged and fired up about all of the other unconstitutional, treasonous abuses that we've sustained, not just from this president in the past 5 years, but from a whole long line of traitors for the past 20? I mean, I'll give you the Patriot Act from the Bush era. Who spoke out about that? Crickets. Now, to make matters worse, the FCC has determined in their infinite wisdom that it is appropriate for them to begin to monitor and determine what is in the best needs, or what is in the best, what are the needs and how are they best met for America by the news organizations. For the record, if this is a new topic for you or you've been hearing about it but you don't really understand it, this is the new FCC multi-market study of critical information needs. Of course, they always give it these innocuous and soft and pleasant-sounding names. It's a multi-market study of critical information needs. I mean, who can't get behind that, right? Well, after you understand what it's all about, the last thing you want to be is behind or, frankly, in front of this thing. First of all, their intent, and here's a major problem, their intent not only on doing this for television and radio, but also newspapers. Well, last I checked, even the traitorous administrative agencies have not delegated to themselves power to regulate newspapers. I mean, they can withhold your television license if you don't do as you're told. They can withhold your radio license if you don't do as you're told. But the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the LA Times and the Chicago Tribune, they don't need a license from the FCC to operate. This is known as the CIN study, or SIN, which is kind of interesting. That's how it sounds, like sin. And Ajit Pai, or P-A-I, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce his name. It's A-G-I-T, so I'm pronouncing it Ajit, which I believe is fairly accurate, and P-A-I is his last name. Now, he's one of the FCC's 5 commissioners. And for the record, these are appointees, right? And by the way, he's one of only, I think, 2 Republicans that sit on the FCC. The other 3 are Democrats. And it's kind of interesting because, for one thing, the person who's heading this up happens to be the daughter of a very influential Democratic member of the Senate. So it's interesting, though, because he's got a couple of things to say. And he sits on the commission now. There's only 5 people, right? So, I mean, this is like saying these guys don't have conversations, because here he says, this has never been put to an FCC vote. It was just announced, says Pai, one of the FCC's commissioners. I've never had any input into the process. Really? So you're going to try and tell me that the FCC has begun something as invasive as probing the public media to make sure that citizens have all the crucial information that they may need. And 3 or 2 or 4 of the 5 people who sit on the commission have never heard of it? I mean, this is a pretty world-shaking event for the FCC. They've identified a group of critical need categories, and here's what they are. Emergencies and risks and information surrounding those. So that would be, what happens when there's a storm coming? Are you properly notifying the community? How are you notifying them that they should evacuate, let's say, in the event of a storm? Health and welfare. Let's see, that's pretty broad. The last time we had the government define welfare clause, they packed almost everything that they are doing that's unconstitutional under that word because, well, it can be used for an enormous range. I mean, are we talking about the welfare of everyone in the country and all of their needs and desires? Kind of interesting. Clyburn, who is the daughter of of House Democratic Rep. James Clyburn, she's been appointed to the FCC, and I believe back in 2012 2012, I think. And it's interesting because her comment, which I mean is fairly interesting, says, "We must emphatically insist that we leave no American behind when it comes to meeting the needs of those in varied and vibrant communities of our nation, be they native-born, immigrant, disabled, non-English speaking, low income, or other." That's fairly broad. And when we're talking about health and welfare, so are we now going to see the FCC require that radio programs and television programs interject Spanish into their reporting so that, or is, will someone have to, translate? You see, their argument is, well, it's only a study. You're making a mountain out of a molehill. But that's a chimera. The real goal here is to get the camel's nose underneath the edge of the tent. And then, utilizing that long and powerful neck, he can lift it up and get the rest of his body through. Information about emergencies and risks. Health and welfare. Education. I wonder if they will want to see fairness doctrine reporting on Common Core. Transportation. Economic opportunities. The environment. Interesting. You guys don't have enough stories here about the dangers that coal-fired power plants create for the vast majority of the nation. I can hear it all now. You guys don't do enough stories about the rising tides of the oceans. Then they add in civic information and, here's the really loaded one, political information. It's interesting. We're down to a few minutes, so let me read this for you. This is the FCC wades into the newsroom. It's an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal, and it's by Mr. Pai. News organizations often disagree about what Americans need to know. MSNBC, for example, apparently believes that traffic in Fort Lee, New Jersey is the crisis of our time. Fox News, on the other hand, chooses to cover the September 2012 attacks on the U.S. diplomatic compound in Benghazi more heavily than other networks. The American people, for their part, disagree completely about what they want to watch. But everyone should agree on this. The government has no place pressuring media organizations into covering certain stories. Unfortunately, the Federal Communications Commission, where I am a commissioner, does not agree. Last May, the FCC proposed an initiative to thrust the federal government into newsrooms across the country with its, quote, multi-market study of critical information needs, or the CIN. The agency plans to send researchers to grill reporters, editors, and station owners about how they decide which stories to run. A field test in Columbia, South Carolina, is scheduled to begin this spring. For the record, by the way, that's the home district of Clyburn, the other FCC director, who happens to be the representative's daughter. The purpose of the CIN, or SIN, according to the FCC, is to ferret out information from television and radio broadcasters about, quote, the process by which stories are selected, and how often stations cover, quote, critical information needs, along with, quote, perceived station bias, and perceived responsiveness to underserved populations. How does the FCC plan to dig up all that information? Well, first, the agency selected 8 categories of critical information, such as the environment and economic opportunities, that it believes local broadcasters should cover. It plans to ask station managers, news directors, journalists, television anchors, and on-air reporters to tell the government about their news philosophy and how the station ensures that the community gets critical information. The FCC also wants to wade into office politics. One question for reporters that will be posed is, quote, have you ever suggested coverage of what you consider a story with critical information for your customers that was rejected by management? Follow-up questions ask for specifics about how editorial discretion is exercised, as well as the reasoning behind the decisions. Participation in the critical information needs study is voluntary, in theory. Unlike the opinion surveys that Americans see on a daily basis and either answer or not, as they wish, the FCC's queries may be hard for the broadcaster to ignore. They would be out of business without an FCC license, which must be renewed every 8 years. This is not the first time the agency has meddled in news coverage. Before critical information needs, there was the FCC's now defunct Fairness Doctrine, which began in 1949 and required equal time for contrasting viewpoints on controversial issues. Though the Fairness Doctrine ostensibly aimed to increase the diversity of thought on the airwaves, was originally aimed to increase the diversity of thought on the airwaves, many stations simply chose to ignore controversial topics altogether rather than air unwanted content that might cause listeners to change the channel. The Fairness Doctrine was controversial and led to lawsuits throughout the 1960s and the 1970s that argued it infringed upon the freedom of the press. The FCC finally stopped enforcing the policy in 1987, acknowledging that it did not serve the public interest. In 2011, the agency officially took it off the books. But the demise of the Fairness Doctrine has not deterred proponents of newsroom policing, and the CIN or SIN study is a first step down the same dangerous path. The FCC says the study is merely an objective, fact fact-finding mission. The result will inform a report that the FCC must submit to Congress every 3 years in eliminating barriers to entry for entrepreneurs and small businesses in the communications industry. This claim is peculiar. How can the news judgments made by editors and station managers impede small businesses from entering the broadcast industry? And why does the SIN study include newspapers when the FCC has no authority to regulate print media? Should all stations follow MSNBC's example and cut away from a discussion with a former congressman about the National Security Agency's collection of phone records to offer live coverage of Justin Bieber's bond hearing? As a consumer of news, I have an opinion. But my opinion shouldn't matter more than anyone else's, merely because I happen to work at the FCC. Well, when we see that kind of response from the FCC itself, or at least one individual on the FCC, we can be assured of one thing and one thing alone: that this is another attempt by the federal administration to utilize and abuse the privileges of power in a manner in which they can create a weapon of mass destruction to silence their enemies, their political opponents, those they considered dissidents. I mean, here we are talking about allowing monitors from the government to enter in and query and question reporters themselves. Why didn't you cover that story? Did you bring that to your management? Did they refuse to let you? First of all, let's understand something. The course of action that any corporation who promotes media takes in its distribution of its news and its slant and bias is not a function that government can and or should have any interest and or role in playing. When I say that, I mean, I'll give you the example of MSNBC as an example. I don't agree with MSNBC's philosophy, but they have a right to continue to do as they do. I don't always agree with CNN or Fox News, but they have the right to have a bias and to promote that bias in their way as they see fit. Now, for the government to step in and again try to make winners and losers, which this government seems to be extraordinarily adept at, number one, finding the losers, but more importantly, extraordinarily adept at exercising abuse of authority and interjecting themselves into a position where they are choosing winners and losers. That is never government's role, and definitely not with the media. Now, I'll give it to you right off the bat. Our media is pretty lame. There's very, very little objectivity, and there's even less active investigative journalism. However, irrespective of those issues, it is not government's job or role or position to go into a news organization and determine how he can utilize their positioning, which makes them vulnerable to his political intimidation. In fact, this one article here in the Washington Examiner says it's not difficult to see how these topics quickly become vehicles for political intimidation. In fact, it's difficult to imagine that they won't. For example, might the FCC standard that journalists must meet on the environment look something like the Obama administration's environmental agenda? Might standards on economic opportunity resemble the president's inequality agenda? The same could hold true for the categories of health and welfare and civic information and pretty much everything else. Pi, being quoted in this article, says an enterprising regulator could run wild with a lot of these topics. The implicit message to the newsroom is that they need to start covering these 8 categories in a certain way, or otherwise the FCC will go after them. So, and I applaud his candor, and I applaud his willingness to come out here and be interviewed on this topic, and to put an op-ed out there, which clearly is going against the grain of the other 4 commissioners, or at least those who voted for this. The real question is this. Do you trust someone like Kathleen Sebelius to be sitting in a newsroom? Would you trust someone like Eric Holder or any of the attorneys general that he has loaded the entire Department of Justice with, who are, quite frankly, dangerous to our nation? Because they don't have an agenda of justice. They have an agenda of social justice. When the rule of law is ignored and objectivity is lost, the news becomes nothing more than government propaganda spewed across the airwaves. And I got to tell you, for the FCC to try to go in there and add newspapers to the mix is particularly disconcerting. First, they have no mandate to control or regulate newspapers. And so where they think they get the idea for that also is a very, very telling fact. They're not interested only in radio and television. They're interested in the vast majority of media coverage, and that includes newspapers. That tells you, as a critical thinker, that there's more to this program than meets the eye, because they don't have any authority to go in there in the first place. And quite frankly, since they don't, for them to include it means that there's a larger agenda. There's a wizard behind the screen, shall we say. The Social Solutions Report, who put this report out, this is the Maryland-based company who's presented this proposal outlining the process. These are the guys who come up with the interview questions that the monitors have to ask the news representatives, the anchors, the whatever. Quote, "The purpose of these interviews is to ascertain the process by which stories are selected." That's none of the government's business. They added that news organizations would be evaluated for, quote, "station priorities for content, production quality, and population served, perceived station bias." Right off the bat, red flags should be flying out of every referee's pocket. I mean, we should see an entire swarm of red flags on the play. Perceived percent of news dedicated to each of the CINs, red flags again, and perceived responsiveness to underserved populations. Right now, there should be a blizzard of red flags. Well, the one thing I can say, and we're down to the last seconds of this segment, is that if the FCC goes forward with this, it will be telling, because it will tell us whether or not the media is under an enormous amount of coercion to accept this kind of betrayal of the constitutional principles of the First Amendment, or whether they have any backbone left and may someday yet redeem themselves. There's the big question. All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about why your AR-15 may fail and what happens if it fails when you need it the most. We'll be right back. You're listening to America's Voice Now.
It's about the restoration of our republic. We want to educate, encourage, enable the power. We stand for integrity, honesty, self-reliance, self-defense, and most importantly, no compromise on our foundational principles. This is America's Voice Now.
Find America's Voice Now on Facebook and at americasvoicenow.org. Here's Michael Evans.
Good morning, America. You're listening to America's Voice Now. We're in our third of four segments this morning. You've caught us halfway into the show. If you're just joining us, glad to have you on board. ABN runs every morning from 8 to about 9:45 a.m. Live on americasvoicenow.org and on patriotfb.com and a number of other sites where our program streams. We have an audio feed through Spreaker. That's like speaker with an R. And then on Patriot FB, you can listen through a live audio feed as well. So we encourage you to participate with us and do that because gives you an opportunity to catch the show live. If you cannot catch it live, there's two different ways that you can hear it. You can catch us on Rooster Radio, Big Country 99, every night from midnight to 2. And then you can also call our listen line, which is a completely free service for you. It is a toll call, so just make sure that you call it from a phone where you don't have to pay by the minute in order to get on there. That phone number is area code 415-325-0725. Again, that listen line number is 415-325-0725. I'd also love to hear from you directly. If you have an interest in contacting me, by all means, please send me an email. You can send it to Mike at americasvoicenow.org. That's Mike at americasvoicenow.org. We do look forward to getting email from you because it kind of keeps us informed as to what your thought process is and how you're receiving the information that we are out there providing for you. There are no FCC monitors here, at least yet, and I can tell you that if the day ever comes when they say you got to have an FCC monitor in every radio host's studio, that I will stop doing the show. So the subject that we're going to tackle this morning on this segment, and our fourth segment later will be what is DLE terrorism and why is it an epidemic in America? DLE stands for Domestic Law Enforcement Terrorism. And we have a rash of police brutality and police state tactics being used on Americans across the board, and we're going to tackle that in our fourth segment. But in this particular one, turns out that for quite some time now, the Army has been aware that their M4 carbine has had, a fairly deplorable reliability record under sustained full automatic fire and or poor maintenance by whoever troop is using it. But they've been kind of keeping this under their hat. And, of course, it's really been kind of difficult for word to get out so that people would be able to. And, of course, when you're in the Army, there's not much you can do. Your hands are kind of tied, right? I mean, you can only deal with the weapon they give you. You can't bring one from home. So, but there are individuals within the military who have actually been purchasing their own parts, which they're, of course, legally forbidden from doing. But the attitude from them is I'd rather get, carried by, I would rather be, heard in a court-martial and judged by six rather than be buried by six. And so these are men in Afghanistan. These are men in Iraq. These are men in special forces and, SOCOM units all over the world. And so essentially the problem that they're having is with the M4A1, which is the military's standard issue carbine. And there are some specific problems that appear to be cropping up with these. And the reason that I wanted to touch on this topic with you this morning is because the idea of the AR-15 being less than ideally reliable, if you will, is certainly problematic for most Americans, for the simple reason that most people out there who are looking for a weapon for home and family protection, we're not talking about carry pistols now, we're talking about carbines, right? And they have a AR-15 carbine. And so when we talk about that, that means that there's an enormous, there are millions of these out there in the marketplace. And, if you're, because you don't have, and you don't put it to the same level of use that the military puts theirs to in terms of consistent usage of fire. I mean, unless you're practicing every day or training, weekly, and you're shooting multiple rounds through this thing, you may never see these particular failures until, of course, you need the gun at its most necessary period. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where the rub comes, because that's not where you want your weapon to fail you. Now, apparently what's happening is there are some specific parts of the weapon, and it's mostly in the trigger guard area or triggers and the tube, the gas feed tube that runs across the top. And you'll generally not see that if you're not really familiar with an AR-15 and its makeup and its parts. That particular piece is not something that you'll necessarily see because it's underneath the handguard. And so, but it's a little tube, and it's very small. It's the size of a pipe cleaner, and it's about so long. And that particular tube, it's got a kind of a funny bent to it. Sometimes you'll see them with a pigtail. The idea is that particular tube, when the bullet passes down the barrel, and as it passes behind it, there's a pile of built-up gas that's pushing that bullet forward, right, from the explosion of ejecting it from the end of the end of the shell. And as that bullet passes through, there's a little tiny hole in the barrel, and that gas goes up and into that tube and comes back and forces the bolt to slide back so that the next round can be lifted up by the magazine, and then the next round can be slid into place in the chamber. Fire a second time. Well, under sustained full auto fire or extensive use, they're finding that there are problems with that tube because it clogs or it has problems where it melts down, and that there are barrels failing, and there are problems with M4s jamming during battle, and these jams are causing major problems for our individuals overseas. These in one of the independent surveys comes back with the quote that these stoppages are having a quote unquote large impact. So what's happening is some of these soldiers have been modifying their own weaponry. Now, the other challenge that they've had, and I've said this about the M4 all along, is that it has a limited range. A .223 caliber bullet is very, very small. By its name, a .223 is the same size diameter bullet as a .22. The same .22 you learned how to shoot with or went out squirrel hunting with last week. I learned how to plink with. That .22 caliber bullet is quite a bit larger for a military M4 carbine or a .223 5.56, and those terms are synonymous and interchangeable for the most part. There are some limitations on that, and you gun guys, don't send me email and give me a 3-page dissertation on the difference between .223 and 5.56. I already know it. But this is a conversation for those who aren't thoroughly understanding of the issue. And so it's a fairly heavy bullet there in the 55 to 62 grain weight versus a 22 being, 40 grains. And there's a lot of powder behind it. And that means that the bullet moves very, very quickly. However, out at, beyond 250 yards, it effectively has no power. And if somebody's wearing armor or a bulletproof jacket or they're behind any kind of cover whatsoever, there's a very, very good chance that the bullet will never actually penetrate. And so what they're finding is that once you've gotten beyond 250 yards, the killing power of this device, of this particular bullet is non-existent. And so they're hitting these guys at these long ranges, and for all intents and purposes, they're not taking them out. Now, in Iraq, where we first went in, and you recall we were in Afghanistan, but then we went over and jumped in on Iraq too, where that was more like house-to-house urban fighting. The 223 is more suited for that environment, or suitable, because of the short distances that you're ordinarily firing, no more than 100 yards. But in Afghanistan, where you've got these broad open areas, it's a challenge for them. That's why, back in Vietnam, when the M16 was first introduced, the troops were pretty unhappy with the whole idea, or at least a lot of them were, and they wanted to stick with the old M14 because that was a .308 caliber cartridge, which one had a lot more power, two had a lot more distance, and it was a very, very flat shooting rifle. So essentially, here's what the long and the short of this is, because I don't want to get too sidetracked on all of the history. But the real issue here is that many of these troops are finding that they really need to replace some of the parts in the weapon with their own parts so that they can feel confident that the weapon is not going to fail on them when they need it the most. And I would strongly encourage you to do the same. Now, there's a number of places where you can obtain high-quality parts and good gear. One of them is Brownells. Brownells has, perhaps been one of the... But remember, Brownells doesn't make anything, right? They only sell other people's products. So don't get caught or hung up looking for a Brownells, name-branded product. But they do have a lot of products that are available. But to be honest with you, with the advent and the volume of AR rifles that are out there now, there's a lot of vendors out there. In fact, I gave you one in a link that you can go to, and that's Red River Guns, REDRIVER Guns, GUNS. And basically all they sell is parts and replacement parts. So if you want to buy a trigger set, if you want to buy washers, if you want to buy springs, if you want to buy one of those little piston gas tubes, if you want to buy a replacement, gas port on the front and things like that, they've got those parts. Green Mountain Defense Industries is another one. Green Mountain Defense Industries. And this is one of the organizations that named in this article that they've been the troops have been purchasing their own gear from. Now, of course, let's be candid, they're not allowed to do this. But again, the point is, if I've got to take a risk of getting a court-martial versus a risk of being shot by the enemy, I think I'm going to opt for the risk of a court-martial. So the other aspect of AR-15s, and a lot of people aren't aware of this, is that when you're talking about very dusty and dirty conditions and a lot of sand, they don't perform as well as they might. So the idea of pristine cleaning and maintenance of those weapons is very, very important. And any AR-15 is a fairly high maintenance weapon. But remember that it's a weapon that for relatively shorter distances is ideal. It's got a high magazine capacity, and at the same point in time, it's lightweight. The ammunition is lightweight, so guys can carry more of it into the field when they're on a deployment where they don't have access to resupply and materiel from the rear and so forth and so on. So there was a lot of reasons why the M4, M16, whatever you want to call it, is a valuable and certainly meets the needs of certain situations. My suggestion, if you're going to have an AR-15, and probably most of the people listening to this either do or they've got one, or either have one or have access to one, would be that you have a series and a group of spare parts available to replace. In some cases, if there's trigger failure or trigger problems, then you can simply just replace that particular piece, or depending upon how you want to accomplish it, you can actually get a trigger that literally you just drop right in, put one pin through the side of the receiver, and you're done. That's a brand new trigger, and it's, these are match grade, high quality triggers, right? So those are options for you. You can always keep around a trigger assembly in an AR-15 is made up of a group of parts. There's a trigger and a hammer and a sear and, so forth and so on. Springs. You need to have at least one complete second set of those for every weapon that you have. And you should have, if it's at all possible, at least one extra bolt around where you can utilize that bolt for any one of a number of AR-15s that you may have. So if you've got a couple of AR-15s in your household, you probably don't need to buy an extra bolt for each one, but having an extra bolt around when you got multiple weapons is not a bad idea. Those bolts are available, and they can be purchased anywhere from about, a bolt and carrier. You want the whole bolt and carrier assembly. That particular piece is probably in the $75 to $150 range, depending upon what you buy. You can buy a $300 one if you want to go nuts, but that's up to you. So my point to you is this. You want to make sure that you have extractors, extra extractors. That's that little piece with a little flanged edge on it that catches the back of the case, the rim of the case, and pulls that bullet back out of the chamber and ejects it, right? That you should have an extra extractor and an extra ejector and extra springs for the weapon. And you can buy whole kits that is like what's called a lower parts kit. And that parts kit will give you basically all the springs and the pins and the, all the parts that you would need to effectively repair and or maintain any given AR weapon. And they're interchangeable. So it doesn't matter whether you have a Colt or whether you've got, a Bushmaster or whether you've got one by Smith & Wesson or whether it doesn't make any difference. AR-15s are built, at least for the most part. There are a couple of exceptions out there. But for the vast majority of AR-15s, you're talking about a single parts kit that will be virtually usable for any weapon, any AR-15 weapon. And so my point to you is this. I talk to a lot of folks who prepare, and they prepare food, and they buy ammunition, and they have weaponry, and they stockpile medicine, and things like that. Well, what I'm trying to get you to remember, or to remind you of doing here, is that it's not enough when you have failed to set aside spare parts as well, because things will break. And whether it's spare parts for a tractor, or if you are living off-grid and you're trying, you're going to need spare parts for your solar system that pumps the water out of your well, or if you're hand pumping it, make sure that you are mindful of the fact that these products can break. And when they do break, you may not necessarily be able to get spare parts. So now's the time for you to be taking advantage of the opportunity for you to get onto the internet and research good pricing and vast options that are available to you. I gave you a couple of names before, and I would encourage you to go out there and do your own homework and research. Again, it's Green Mountain Defense Industries. You can go to Brownells, or you can go to Red River Guns. And again, the lower parts kit is a fairly inexpensive option, and it gives you a full, complete set of all the springs and all of those things. So keeping one of those on hand, you may well find. And I got to tell you, in this report that they're looking here, and they had testing that was done by numerous entities, including the Picatinny Arsenal and so forth and so on. They were finding that the recoil buffers, the extractor springs, the trigger assemblies, and in some cases the magazines and the bolts, and in some cases even the barrel and the chambers themselves were failing. So don't get caught short is what I'm trying to say. Now, you're talking here, of course, about weapons that are firing at under a fully automatic load, which is a much higher cyclical rate, and it creates an enormous amount of heat and stress on the weapon. Most people, 99.99999% of the AR-15s out there, are not going to be fully automatic. And so, it's unlikely that you're going to sit there and melt down your barrel like you could with an M4 in a hot firefight somewhere in Fallujah. But we are talking about incidents where we're talking about as little as 850 rounds fired. Now, that's not an enormous high volume of rounds. Certainly not in a situation where you may find yourself protecting your home and your family for some extended window or period of time. And so don't be caught short. What I'm trying to make you understand here is that it's important and critical for you to have spares on hand, not just for your rifles and your pistols. I'm using this story as an example for you so that you recognize how important it is to make sure that you've got spare magazines, the springs within those magazines. It's not a bad idea to have some extras. And, and it's not limited, of course, just to the issues of, AR-15s or weaponry. It can be a lot of things, including, like I mentioned before, a well that's, a hand-pumped well, or some piece of machinery that you might rely on. If you've got a windmill, as an example, that's generating or pumping water for you, or any of those issues, you got to have spare parts on hand. Because if they fail when you need them the most, they're going to do you absolutely no good, and many spares will likely not be available to you, at least immediately or in any reasonable period of time. So, with that being said, will your AR-15 fail you when you need it most? Maybe not, but you're always better off to be prepared. So don't overlook that. All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we return, we're going to come back and talk about our final topic this morning, which is, what is domestic law enforcement terrorism, and why has it become an epidemic in the United States? Okay, before we wrap, I'm going to ask you to visit some of our sponsors and make sure that you let them know that you are a listener of AVN and that you've heard about their particular business or enterprise here with us. It's one of the ways in which they can track their advertising and make sure that their advertising dollar works. And it's one of the things that makes them want to stay and continue to advertise with us when they're seeing results. So please make sure that you do that. I'd like to introduce you to the folks over at Mini Mart Express 1 and 2. Those are both located in West Plains. One is up on the corner of 14 and 63 as you're coming into town from the west. And you will see a location there. It used to be the Old Granny's Cafe. And make sure that you swing in there. They have a drive-through to make it really easy for you. And they have the lowest prices on fountain drinks and tobacco products. In their and they have liquor and beer in that facility as well. If you go down to Porter Wagoner Boulevard and you're near the People's Park in that Four Corner area, they have another location there right across the street from People's Park. And that is Express Mini Mart 1. Again, they have a drive-through in that location, so I encourage you to use that, especially if the weather is foul. And let those folks know that you heard about them on America's Voice Now. Please visit our friends over at Wits End Classic Barbershop. Get yourself a great haircut for $10. Patriot Cigar and Tobacco Shop, also on the square in West Plains. And you can find them or call them at 417-257-1776. I'd also like you to visit the offices of Jason Henry, the law offices of Jason Henry. You can reach him if you can use his services at 417-256-4100. And make sure that you swing in while you're on Porter Wagoner Boulevard to swing in and see our friends over at Pizza Hut. They have a great lunch special on Tuesdays and Thursdays, reduced prices. It's available every day during the week, and on Tuesday night, kids eat free. Make sure that, again, you see our friends over at Battery Station at batterystation.com, and also 303 Washington Avenue. And they can make sure, by the way, Wednesday is the cutoff for the food co-op, so take advantage of that. I'll talk to you about that when we come back. But don't miss food co-op cutoff next Wednesday. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in just a moment. All right. We return. So, this topic, and before we get into there, I want to talk to you about Battery Station's food co-op program that they've put together for our listenership, and I want you to participate in that. Before we get too much further down the road, we'll wrap on that. But this segment is going to be, what is domestic law enforcement terrorism, and why and how has it become an epidemic in the United States ride with us for this segment. I think you'll find it informative and valuable to you. If you like that segment I just did about AR-15 rifles, I'd love to hear from you. By all means, send me an email and just say, hey, I like it. I'd like to hear more topics like that, or less. And kind of give me some feedback on what you guys want to hear, because this is a program that, I want you to tune in and listen every day. And I know sometimes it's nice to get away from the political aspects of things a little bit, even if it's only just a segment once in a while. I know an awful lot about weapons. I was, an armorer and a fairly competent gunsmith in my time. And so I'm certainly in a position, and I have a lot of knowledge about weaponry and ballistics and ammunition and things like that. So I can certainly, expound on those kinds of things. And things, maybe it's not that topic at all. Maybe it's about how should we be a better prepper? How can we, what do we need in a basic bug-out bag? Or how do we obtain the right ingredients? Or things along those of that nature, and along those lines. If you like that kind of topic, give me a shout. Send me an email to mike@americasvoicenow.org. That's Mike at americasvoicenow.org. And I'll be happy to try to meet that request. Okay, we're going to diverge here for a moment, and we're going to look at another topic altogether, which is the issue of domestic law enforcement. Now, for the record, if this is something new to you, I'm surprised, because we have been inundated lately. And it's not just that the news is more prevalent and there's more outlets talking about it. I'm sure that's some aspect of it. But the truth is, we are having and experiencing, as we speak, a rise in the police state of the United States of America. What we're seeing is a terrible, and I do mean terrible, migration towards law enforcement, which is increasingly being utilized for military-like deployments. And we're talking about the most silly and arcane and idiotic things that these law enforcement agencies are being tasked with, and they're approaching them as if every incident that they go out on a warrant service requires them to shoot first and ask questions later. Now, I posted a story up this morning that I found very disturbing. In fact, I posted quite a few of them. So the issue of, and I'll give you an example of a couple of them. But one of them, and I was really mad when I read these this morning. There was a young boy of 17 years old. The police knocked on his door the other day. They were there for his father. And his father was on probation, don't know, or care for what. And apparently he had missed a probation meeting or something he was supposed to be attending. And so the father wasn't home. The kid answered the door. He asked who was there through the door. There was no answer. He opened the door up, and he had a Wii controller, a video game controller, in his hand. One of the female officers there fired immediately, and he was killed. That's one story of literally thousands upon thousands of stories of people who were completely innocent, operating, in many cases, not even involved with the police. I mean, if you knew and you studied any of the information out there about how many people are killed in no-knock raids where the police entered the wrong home, the wrong address, or the informant gave them information that turned out to be false later on. But they go in there with guns blazing, and they're killing American citizens. Killing them. Lots of them. And I do mean lots. There are as many people killed by law enforcement forces domestically right here in the United States since 9/11 as there were in all of Iraq for the past since 9/11. In other words, more Americans were killed since 9/11 by police than were killed in the entire same period in Iraq. Radley Balco is an author. He writes for a number of different organizations, not the least of which is the Cato Institute, but he's also he's a a columnist for the Huffington Post. And he has got a book out there that's called Overkill, The Rise of Paramilitary Police in America. Now, to be honest with you, this publication is probably about, at this stage, probably 7 or so years old. And at the end of it, I think it came out around 2006 or something. And at the end of it, he has literally pages and pages and pages and 100 pages, half the book is stories of innocent people, either wrongly accused or they knocked on the wrong door, or they didn't knock at all and they just pounded the door down with a ram, and Grandpa comes out in his skivvies with a double-barrel shotgun, thinking he's being home invaded by those hooligans down the street. Who wouldn't think that? These police don't knock anymore. These are all no-knock warrants. And when you have a scenario where law enforcement is being taught and encouraged to know and understand military tactics, this is what you're going to have. And there is no doubt about it. These accidents that are occurring are not accidents. DLE, terrorism, that's what I call it. Domestic law enforcement terrorism. Why do I say that? Well, the headlines are replete with thousands of cases of people being abused. I mean, I've posted up on our Facebook page this morning. A woman was pulled over by a police officer for driving in the high occupancy vehicle lane. When she told him that she was filming him on her iPhone, he attempted to grab the phone from her, tried to pull her out of the truck. She leaned over, jumped into the passenger seat. He ended up taking her to prison, or taking her to jail, and she stayed overnight in the jail. Well, he told her she was arrested for a felony. With all due respect, apparently these law enforcement officers are taught the tactics of how to maim, kill, and injure, but they're not taught the law, because the Supreme Court just recently passed and not so recently that they shouldn't have known about it. We're talking a year or two ago, a couple of years ago, I think it was, 2 years, that it is within the purview of your First Amendment right to video police officers during their dutiful services, whether it's towards you or you are a third party. End of argument, ladies and gentlemen. And any cop who doesn't know that by now is telling you a lie. They know it. They just don't like being filmed because it provides evidence. In another case, the cop assaults a guy who was recording him arresting someone else in a Brooklyn subway station. And you see, these police arrest these people for recording them. But more often than not, these altercations get out of hand. Look at Kelly Thomas, which I've had up on our website. That particular case is one of horrific consequences. I mean, Kelly Thomas was a flat-out, unmitigated, no holds barred, no doubt, no semblance of doubt, no shadow of a doubt in your mind, a murder. Murder. And those two cops, they're walking free. There was a case that wasn't so long ago. I believe it was in, I think it was Massachusetts or Connecticut, where someone who worked in a laboratory was tampered with the evidence in over 40,000. And I want you to hear that number again, because we're not talking about 400. We're not talking about 4,000. We're not talking about anything but the staggering sum of 40,000 cases where this individual tampered with the evidence from a laboratory, and people are spending their days behind bars based on that evidence. That's not inexcusable. That person, let me put it to you this way. There is nothing you can do to that government official who tampered with that evidence that would make up for the 40,000 people that are sitting in jail. Certainly some percentage of them are innocent. And by the way, what's the cost to the taxpayers for that little indiscretion? Because every one of those 40,000 is entitled to a completely new trial. There's a story here of officers repeatedly, not once, repeatedly spraying mace inside of a woman's private parts to, quote, punish her. See, this is far beyond the situation of, I've got to restrain these people for my safety. What we're seeing now is a sadistic pleasure that is coming from this. I read an article the other day about a guy who his father was, he went out, his father is neurologically impaired, has had some kind of a neurological impairment that makes him not be able to hold on to things. He was smoking a cigarette outside. He dropped the cigarette. He's in very poor health. The son went out. The police officer saw him drop the cigarette and was going to write him a ticket for $1,000. I mean, ladies and gentlemen, right off the bat, anything else you say, you cannot justify a $1,000 ticket for dropping a cigarette on the ground. I don't care how much of an environmental Nazi you are. And the guy came out and said, he's disabled. Let me try to pick up the cigarette. And, we don't really have $1,000 to pay this ticket. And he wasn't being a litter bug. He was just incapacitated. The cop wasn't accepting that. They got into an altercation. The cop had shot this guy in his genitals with a taser and stood there while the mother stood there screaming, looking at her and looking her in the eye like I'm looking at you right now each time he pulled the trigger, knowing that she was watching her son being tortured. Ladies and gentlemen, that's not police work. That's something we'd expect from the Inquisition. That's something that we would expect to see in the prisons of Iraq under Saddam Hussein. That's something that we would expect to see in Mubarak's Egypt. That's something we would expect to see out of Nazi Germany. The truth of the matter is, we have a very serious, and I do mean serious, epidemic of domestic law enforcement terrorism being propagated, promulgated, and employed and deployed against American citizens. And it is time that it ceased. The truth is, we need to stop being politically correct about what it is. It's not police brutality. It's terrorism. How am I defining that? Terrorism is the use of fear to change behavior. Ladies and gentlemen, what's happening here is domestic law enforcement terrorism. Make no mistake about it. murder by cop, assault by cop. These are an epidemic and a blight on our nation. 17-year-old boy shows up at the door with a Wii game controller in his hand, you know, the kind that you play tennis with. Cop, I'm sure, looking up, sees motion with the hand, thinks gun. Pow, pow, pow. Kid's dead. Was that warranted? I mean, first of all, why do you have multiple law enforcement officers going to a scene to get a guy who's already on probation for a probation violation? Nothing he could have done, short of some other kind of murder or something along those lines, warranted multiple officers on a no-knock warrant execution. And I use the word execution with the pun intended. This young fella, 17-year-old kid, he was sitting down to watch a movie on his Wii. He was in the ROTC, and he was joining the Marines. That was his life plan for the next 10 years of his life. And his life was snuffed out. For what? For what? Because some officer can say, well, training took over. Then we've got a problem with the training you're receiving. The military has a phrase: we train as we fight, and we fight as we train. But when domestic law enforcement, which has a completely different mandate and a completely different level of responsibility to the American citizen, is training in military tactics and fashion, and is utilizing those against the citizenry that they are supposedly supposed to be protecting and serving, we have a major disconnect. And I'm telling you, now is the time for it to end. I can find you within 2 hours 100 cases minimum where someone ended up dead and the department simply said the officer followed procedure. No reprimand, no one fired. That's inexcusable. There are no excuses. There are no exceptions. There are no explanations. Murder is murder. And it doesn't really matter whether you're wearing a uniform when you commit it or not. There's no justification for what was done to that young man. What it shows you, and what it should be telling you, is that our nation is on the brink, and I do mean on the brink, of a police state the likes of which the world has never seen. We're already entered. We've already gone through the door, and we are irrefutably, and quite honestly, I believe, irretrievably and irreversibly within the confines and the construct of a totalitarian police state. It would take generations of law enforcement to get this mentality out of their minds. Is every cop dirty? No. Is every cop a killer? No. Is law enforcement a valuable and necessary thing for our nation? Of course. But there is a difference between law enforcement and the imposition of domestic terrorism by men in blue uniforms instead of green or camouflage. Make no mistake about it, America. where we are headed is a place where you've ignored, and for a very good reason, because you know, understand, and I believe that you have come to the conclusion that what is going to happen in this nation is so horrific, you don't want to face that reality. We're not talking about the federal government out of control. We're not talking about your state government out of control. We're talking about the local police in your city, in your town. Maybe you'd only have a sheriff's office because you live in a rural location where there isn't a city to have a police force. Many of these people and these men and women put their lives on the line every day. And I'm certainly not trying to take anything from anyone who is righteously in law enforcement. But I got to tell you, I look at you as a law enforcement officer who takes umbrage at what I say, and I throw that right back at you and say, wait a second. We say constantly, if you're, and about, everybody wants to characterize Muslims as the threat, right? Well, and then there's a lot of Muslims that say, wait a second, being Muslim is not necessarily, doesn't mean you're a terrorist. And we say, great, then prove it to us and weed your own ranks out. You separate them. You take responsibility and remove them. And if you are unwilling to do that, or you refuse to do that, then you are complicit. That's a message to every law enforcement agent out there. And I don't care whether you are Barney Fife to the highest federal agency. You have an obligation to look around you. And when there are dirty officers, you separate them and you protect us from them. You know who's a nutcase on your team. I'm telling you, America, this is getting ugly. And it has reached epidemic levels when we have had more 5,000 Americans dead since 9/11 at the hands of police. You know how many people we lost in Iraq since 9/11? 3,500. 5,000 American citizens dead since 9/11 at the hands of police. We've lost 2,000 in Afghanistan, thereabouts. So it won't be much longer at the pace we're at where we will have had more Americans killed since 9/11 than we have had killed in war by local police. You've been listening to America's Voice Now. I got to tell you, this is a major issue. It's a major problem. And you should be cognizant of it and trying to determine how you can change this and if you're in law enforcement, resist it. And if you're not in law enforcement, make your community aware of it and do what you need to do to make sure that your family is not subjected to this. Those of you who are in law enforcement, you know who you are. This is a serious problem, and it's time that you admitted there's an addiction to violence within the police. You've been listening to America's Voice Now. Find us live on the web at americasvoicenow.org. You can find us on patriotfb.com. You can find us on facebook.com/America's Voice Now. And you can find every program that we do on YouTube at youtube.com/America's Voice Now. I encourage you and ask you to please share these videos with people within your circle of influence. Have a great weekend. God bless. Goodbye.